morning, anyone. This is Daniele Capezzone, view from Italy, the Watcher Post from the UTOPIA Studios in Rome. This week, a comment and an anniversary. Let's start with a comment. Let's have a bit of optimism. Let's use some optimism, and let's think of the moment when in the future, in the next months, we will get rid of this pandemic emergency and we will be fully free once again. We will enjoy once again full liberty. Well, thinking now of that future moment, I totally agree with Janet Daly, the great commentator for the Sunday Telegraph, who wrote, "We don't have to forget the mistakes which have been made by so many governments during this 2020 and 2021. Also, when this emergency is over, we should make a full and proper examination of the decisions which have been made, and we shouldn't be dismissing what has happened as a nightmare, as a bad dream. We will have to ask ourselves why and how we accepted to give up so easily our liberties. We will have to ask ourselves why and how we accepted this Chinese-like form of on and off lockdown. We will have to ask ourselves why and how we, as Westerners who always pride ourselves on beating the Soviet Empire and the Eastern German-like kind of surveillance, we have accepted to import that method into our countries. And we will have to tell ourselves an unpleasant truth. It is not true that there were no alternatives. An alternative was at hand. 6-7 months ago, there was the great Barrington Declaration signed in the US by so many scientists and experts and commentators and doctors who explain that it was possible to follow a different way. They urged our governments to protect the vulnerable, old people, but at the same time, they urged our governments not to impose general lockdowns, and not only to protect the economy, which otherwise would have been, as it has happened, terribly hit, but also to protect public health. We will have to ask ourselves how many cancers have been diagnosed too lately. We will have to ask ourselves how many chemotherapy cycles have been interrupted or disrupted. We will have to ask ourselves how many heart diseases have been underestimated or delayed in their diagnosis and treatments. These are questions we will have to ask ourselves, and it will be important to be sincere in investigating our political mistakes. My last remark today is an anniversary. Yesterday it was the 8th of April, and 8 years ago there was the passing of a giant of the second half of the last century, Margaret Thatcher, who passed away on the 8th of April 2013. We all know so many things about her wonderful career, 3 electoral victories, victory in the Falkland War, her fight against the British Union, her contribution in the fight against international communism. We know many things about her, but there is one important thing which is represented by her emotional profile, her character. I strongly advise you to read best biography, which has been written by Charles Moore, who is a great British journalist. He has been editor of The Spectator and of The Telegraph. Now he is a commentator for that paper and that magazine. And before Mrs. Thatcher died, she wanted him as her official biographer. In one volume of this biography, there is a story I'd like to tell you, which tells a lot about Mrs. Thatcher. It's the story of her first meeting in Britain with President Gorbachev and her wife Raisa Gorbachova, whom she invited to Chequers. And it was intended to be a friendly dinner, but before dinner started, there was not a conversation, but an extremely tough interrogation led by Mrs. Thatcher on the superiority of the capitalist and democratic and Western system over the communist and authoritarian one. And of course, Mr. Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Communist Party, answered as he could, defending his position, but Mrs. Thatcher was never satisfied with his objections and defense, and her questions became even tougher and tougher, so that even Mrs. Thatcher's interpreter and aides were worried that the dinner might come out as a disaster. At the moment of the maximum tension, Mrs. Thatcher stopped, paused, and said, the most difficult part of our conversation is over. Now we can have a dialogue. That's Mrs. Thatcher's lesson. First, you have to defend your principles. Then you can have a soup even with the devil. This is something that also Mrs. von der Leyen and Mr. Michel should have remembered in Ankara meeting President Erdogan. That's all for today. See you next Friday. Have a nice weekend.